Hi everyone, and welcome to our second video in the Improving Your Analysing Arguments skills. We have a series of 3 videos. You may have watched the first one talking about the nuts and bolts of language analysis. This one is about writing consistently good language analysis pieces. So if you're out there and you feel like you're doing okay when it comes to writing language analysis pieces, or perhaps sometimes you struggle to always hit it out of the park, we're going to run through some habits that you should always be in when you're looking to annotate the articles and when you're going to write these pieces. These are about not just having the nuts and bolts of argument analysis down pat, but going that little bit further and ensuring that your pieces are consistently good and of that really solid standard, so that once you get there, you can look to improve yourself even further. The way that we're going to do that is that we're going to take a look at about 5 or 6 different habits, and I'm going to show you some examples of what that looks like. And I encourage you to make sure that you're stealing some of the things that you see there on your screen today. Steal some of the sentence starters, steal some of the ways in which it introduces how language impacts upon a reader, and start to use these things in your practice pieces. As I mentioned before, this is the second of 3 videos. So when you feel like you've mastered the skills in this video and you feel like you're always engaging in these habits and writing these consistently good analysis pieces, you might want to move on to our 3rd video, which we've titled The 8 Hallmarks of the Very Best Argument Analysis Pieces. But for now, take a look at these habits and ask yourself whether you're doing them every time you go about writing an argument analysis for Section C. And so the first skill that we're going to look at is understanding argument and always being able to pick up on when that argument shifts. And so, of course, when we're engaging with an area of study that's titled argument analysis, we need to make sure that we're aware of what arguments are. But the best way that we can do that is to talk about when they change. And so there's many things that I'm sure your teacher's taken you through with this, looking at signposting and things like that. But when we see really good, consistent analysis pieces, they comment on where those arguments shift, and they start to use language like you can see on your screen at the moment. Having outlined his disgust at the state of the town's once beautiful hall, Montgomery turns his attention to possible solutions. And so what we see there is that by beginning that sentence of analysis with the word having, it's showing an understanding that this person has already outlined an argument and is now moving on to another. And so that's a structure that you can look to incorporate into your writing. Having done this, Montgomery turns his attention to, and it's just a way of you showing the assessor that you have an understanding that the arguments move and that they shift from one tact to another. You can see with the second example, however, Benson moves beyond the financial benefits of the proposal to then outline the enormous potential for the well-being of the city's residents should they embrace his plan. So that idea of moving beyond, that idea of referencing the argument that you've just analysed before going on to the next one, is a surefire way to show subtly that you understand how the writer moves from one argument to the next. And that last one that we see there, Lambert moves from logically pointing out the clear negatives of the situation to then evoke fear and a sense of vulnerability from the reader as he, and it continues. And so with all of those structures there, what they are doing is subtly reinforcing to the person reading your analysis that you understand not only that different arguments have been used, but that the writer has purposely moved from one to the other in a way that moves through the piece and in a threaded way where it all comes together to support their contention and their purpose. And so the second skill that we're going to look at today is about tone. And this is something that students often do as a bit of a checklist. They think that there's this box that assessors have to tick that shows that a student has understood the tone, and they merely do things in the introduction like identifying the tone and then moving on and never mentioning it again. So what are the habits of the students who are writing consistently good analysis pieces? They don't just identify the tone, they analyse it. So what I mean by this is, don't just tell me that you understand what tone has been used, and don't think that just by using one fancy word means that you're going to be knocking this out of the park. Show me that you understand how the tone has been used. And so with the examples that we've got there, you can see where this has been done. Through such bold statements and a blunt approach to getting things done, Kimball is able to present the council's ideas as pragmatic and necessary for all townspeople. through this he, and that'll go on there to analyse why he would have done that and get to how he's trying to get a reaction from the reader. You'll also notice in that first one that it hasn't actually used the word tone itself. This is a habit of these better scoring pieces. It's not a rule. It definitely doesn't mean that if you use the word tone, you're going to be writing a low scoring piece, but it can be a little challenge if you're writing in quite a pedestrian way and you're writing in a formulaic way that says the writer uses X or Y tone. It can be a way of moving beyond that. So instead of actually just having a basic simple word, it talks about bold and blunt approach to the language, and that's been used there. And you can see how it doesn't just identify it, but rather talks about why the writer has done that. With that second example, as a party moves to a more considered approach as she discusses her own challenges to find a better balance. This allows her to connect with her reader and lead them to feel, and it would go on from there. And so a couple of things you'll notice with this. Again, it hasn't actually used the word tone. It's talking about how she moves to a considered approach. Just like argument, tones shift. And if you're showing a holistic understanding of how the whole piece has been put together, you'll be able to analyse where those tones have shifted and why they've done it. And so this considered approach, but then check out the start of this sentence. This allows her to connect. That can be a sentence starter that you can use that allows you to be able to analyse why that tone has been used. So in summing that up, let's make sure we're doing more than identifying the tone. Let's make sure we're analysing why it has been used. Let's make sure that we're not just putting down a term that we understand, but rather talking about why the person has used that. Number 3. We've called this skill analysing the macro and the micro. And so what I mean by that is being able to look at the bigger picture and the big things that are going on with this article, but then also being able to drill down into the nuances of language, the little things that the writer is doing. And so we've given you a definition of what we mean by these two terms. Macro meaning the bigger picture, that means arguments, approaches, the overall points being made, the purpose of the writer, what they're trying to do in that big and bold sort of a way. And you can see those being brought out in the last two examples that we've had about tone and argument. They are macro things. They are things that exist for sections of the piece or the whole piece overall. When we talk about micro, we're talking about the features, the smaller things that combine to become the bigger features of the piece. And so when we take a look at how this can be done, you'll see here in the example that it reads, Wingard's use of the word toxic culture evokes feelings of mistrust and uncertainty as the reader begins to question the workplace of the company. And so that's a very micro feature. That is analysing two words that have been used in that sample piece that we've made up. Toxic culture. It is taking a look at the use of language with two words and then talking about how those two words allow the reader to see the bigger picture about the company's culture or whatever it might be in another light. And so the most effective way of doing this is to think about what arguments can I see and what big things can I see happening in this piece, and where are the little uses of language, the single word analysis and those types of things that are happening to make sure that we're showing our full appreciation and our understanding of how those arguments have come together. The next one reads, through her descriptions of the workers as heroes, Lahiri promotes the value of the work and leads the audience to consider the necessity for such people in the community. So again, we can see in the one sentence that we have the single word analysis of heroes, but then talking about how that goes on to allow the reader to see those people in a certain light and that bigger argument. Quite often when students are writing pretty broad and general analysis pieces, I'll often say to them, I want you to include in your next piece just single word analysis, because it's a really great way of balancing it out, making sure that we're looking at that bigger picture. That's really important that we're doing that, but also considering the smaller things that make up that big picture. Sometimes there are students that just write very narrow and limited analysis and they only focus on singular words or short terms. And sometimes there are students that only focus on the big arguments and they don't drill down into that specific use of language. The most effective students are the ones that can consider both and analyse them simultaneously to give a really well-rounded analysis of how language and argument has been used. So the fourth habit of students that are writing consistently good analysis pieces is the student that is always considering the writer and the reader relationship. And much like tone, it's about going further than just identification. If the piece has been written for school teachers, if the piece has been written for union workers, if the piece has been written for taxpayers in an upcoming election, then it's not enough just to simply mention that you understand that in the introduction and then just forget about it. You need to be considering that throughout your entire piece. And if you are going to be showing the assessor on the exam that you understand how language has been used better than other people that have done the exact same piece, well then you need to be able to show that you understand the writer and the reader relationship. And so you'll see the example there. Roach quells the anxiety of the workforce by beginning her piece with a statement regarding no job losses. And so we can see there obviously that if this person is talking to a workforce and if they've used the language no job losses, well that is something that has been specifically chosen to affect those people. If she is speaking to them about their livelihoods, then we're going to be talking about the fact that she's chosen that blunt opening of no job losses to quell their anxiety. And so if I'm reading that as an assessor, I'm looking at a student that understands how the language has been curated directly for the person that it's there for. It means that we're going beyond a simple, they said this so it'll make them feel guilty. They said this so it'll make them feel sad. They said this and it'll make them feel hopeful. To rather think about they said this because they understood the audience was this type of person with this type of needs. It sounds basic, but it's something that can be a real separator between the students who are just analysing language at a whim and those that are really considering the specific choices made by the writer and showing that understanding that the writer has that clear audience in mind. And the last topic that I want to bring up with today's video isn't so much of a skill, but rather something that we need to avoid if we're going to be writing consistently good pieces. And that is to avoid what we call technique hunting. And that is that student that realizes that there are persuasive devices that writers use and that we can have meta language that we use to describe these terms, such as rhetorical language, inclusive language, etc., and that they feel like it's a bit of a competition or playing bingo to see where they've said that, and they just write these very bland analysis pieces. If we're going to be writing consistently good pieces, we're going to be avoiding this behavior. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't analyze things like inclusive language or anything like that, but it means that we do so at a level where we consider who the audience is and why that language has been used specifically. And so a really good acid test that you can use for this is the example that we've got here on the screen at the moment. Ask yourself that question. Look at the analysis that you've put down and ask yourself, could this be said about any piece which used such a thing? So as an example, if you've written somewhere in your analysis, Taylor uses the word we as an example of inclusive language, the reader feels included and part of the argument when he uses that term we or us. You could say that about any piece that uses the word we or us. It is a bland, pretty basic understanding of how language works. If you're including like a textbook definition of why someone would use a rhetorical question or an appeal to emotion or something like that, you're writing very pedestrian sort of analysis. And so it can be a habit that you want to look to get out of. And rather, you can tweak that to talk about why someone would want to include themselves or how someone might want to appeal to a particular type of audience. And so it needs to be specific and considering the audience like we talked about before. If a writer is talking to a bunch of parents and they say, we as mothers understand, well then we can talk about the nuance of how that writer is looking to come across as a relatable parent who understands the struggles. That is a specific analysis that's specific for that audience, not just a textbook definition of what inclusive language or a rhetorical question might be. And so they are the habits that we've laid out there for you to be writing consistently good analysis pieces. You might have some other questions. Please put them down there in the comments. We'd love to get there and help you out if there's anything else that you're struggling with in this area. If you feel like you're nailing all of those things, you might want to jump onto our third video in this series where we talk about the hallmarks of the absolute highest scoring pieces. If you feel that some of the stuff that we've gone over today perhaps isn't quite ready for you just yet and you need to really just get the foundations of language analysis ready, you might want to check out our first video, which we've titled The Nuts and Bolts of Language Analysis. If you've got something out of the video, you can feel free to like it and to subscribe to our channel so that way you'll be kept up to date with all of our future videos where we can help you out with your study on your VCE journey. Until next time, all the best with your studies and good luck.